In this challenge, you will practice creating and querying a SQLite database. In this database, you will create one table called users, and it will have a user ID column, a first name column, a last name column, and an email address column. Once the table is created, insert 5 entries into the database. Once the database is initialized with the correct data, query the database to retrieve all the email addresses. You may need to do some research to figure out how to do this query. For this challenge, you will use the SQLite 3 module with SQL statements or use SQL Alchemy to create the database and query for data. The next lesson will give examples to both types of solutions. Good luck! Let's walk through the SQLite 3 module version first. Remember, the goal is to create a SQLite database using Python. This may be different than your implementation, and that's okay. There are lots of different solutions that will work here. By walking through this solution, you'll see another take on how to solve the challenge, and likely learn something new. Let's get started. The first step is to import the module. So we'll import SQLite 3, which will allow us to create the database. We'll create a connection object with SQLite3.connect, and we'll call our database users SQLite.db. From here, we'll grab the cursor object with connection.cursor, save that in a variable called cursor, and then we'll create our table. We'll do that using the cursor.execute and type in our SQL query. We'll say create table, if not exists, so it'll create users if it doesn't already exist, and then we'll put in our columns. I'll also save this up so we get our Python formatting. I'll place it in my desktop, and we'll call this SQLite challenge.py. Here we have our columns. The user ID column feels like a good column that we can use to identify each record individually. Plus, by making it a primary key, we can later link it to other tables we create in our relational database with a foreign key. Auto increment also makes it so that we don't have to give a value for the user ID for each record. SQLite will increment it for us. It will come up with a value and store it with each record we insert. On a production scale, likely you wouldn't use auto increment because it requires more overhead, but for our prototype application, this is fine for now. Let's create some data to insert into the database. We'll save it in a variable called users.to_insert and create some users. This will be a list of users we want to insert into the database. These are the users, and they're each stored in a tuple object so we can easily insert them into the database using execute many. We'll write cursor.execute many, and what do we want to execute? In this case, that's an insert statement to insert our users into the database. We're going to give it a first name, and this will be in the users table with an S, so make sure that's plural. We'll also give it a last name and the email address. That's the data we have in our tuples, and we'll pass it in with values, our placeholders, and then pass in the data users to insert. So that's our variable. There we go. With the data inserted, we'll select it. So we'll go cursor.execute, select email address from users. Then we'll use the cursor to fetch that data. And then we'll select all the users. So I can show you that primary key that's added, that user ID that's added automatically. So we'll do select star from users and print out that as well. After we print the data, we'll make sure to commit the changes, and so those additions with connection.commit, and then we'll close the connection. All right, we're ready to run it in the terminal. If I run ls, we can see our Python file there. I'll run it with Python 3 and the file name. And it looks like we misspelled something. Very common mistake here. We'll go connect, run it again. And it looks like auto increment should be one word, so we'll do that. Save it up, run it again. Another misspelling. We'll do users to insert, that's our variable name. And here we go. There's our data. We have our email addresses, and these are the email addresses that we've inserted. And then we have each piece of data in our database. And so this second printout is our select all statement. So this is looking good. We also have the user ID associated with each entry that was generated by our database. Let's clear this up and walk through the SQL Alchemy version of this application. We'll want to create a virtual environment, and I'll do that with virtual env and type in SQLite SQL Alchemy workspace. I'll CD into it with SQLite SQL Alchemy workspace, and we'll activate the environment with source bin/activate. I'll clear this up, and now we're ready to create our SQL Alchemy file. I'll save this inside of our workspace, and we'll call it SQL Alchemy-challenge.py. And before we start working on this Python file, we'll need to install the SQL Alchemy dependency into our virtual environment. So we'll write pip3 install SQL Alchemy. Make sure we have it, looking good, so we can import it into our application. We'll write import SQL Alchemy as DB, so we'll reference it as DB throughout this file. Then we'll create the engine with db.createEngine and put in our database type and the file path to the database we want to create. In this case, it'll be a new database, so we'll do users-SQLAlchemy.db. We'll create a metadata object with db.metadata. And we'll create the connection with engine.connect. So now we're ready to make queries on the database. The first thing we'll want to do is create the table. So we'll do users equals db.table, creating the users table. We'll pass in our metadata object and create some columns. We'll do db.column, user ID, and we'll make it an integer type along with a primary key. Then we'll add the rest of the columns. To create the table, we'll do metadata.createAll and pass in that engine that will create the table for us. And then we'll insert our values. To do that, we'll create an insertion query with users.insert.values, and we'll pass in all the values we want to insert, all the data we want to insert into the database. Great, there's our data. Let's execute the query. We'll do connection.execute and pass in that query, and then we'll select what's in our database. We'll create that selection query with db.select, and we'll want to select the email addresses, so we'll grab the users table, the columns, and we want the email address column in particular, and then we'll select those results. So we'll do selection result equals connection.execute. We'll execute the query we just created, selection query, and then we'll grab the data. We'll print selection result.fetch all. We'll save it up and run it in the terminal. I'll run ls. There's our Python file. We'll do Python 3 SQL Alchemy challenge.py. And we have some errors. It looks like our file path needs one more slash. Let's try it again. And here we are. These are the email addresses. We have 5 of them, and the data looks great.